He dropped Sarah back off at her house and went home to get some work done. Later at home that night, Jesse was in his study, working on the monthly billing for his father's church, when he heard a scratching sound behind him. He turned around, but there was nothing there, only the old wooden box he'd brought back from the church. He went back to finishing up his work, but there it was again, the scratching noise. He turned to look once more, but again, there was nothing there. Again, the scratching noise started up, but this time, he saw where it was coming from. It was coming from the old box. He got up and went over to it, and was just about to open it when the phone rang, stopping him. Jesse returned to his desk and picked up the phone. "Hello? Oh, hi, Dad. Yes, I did, but it was only for a..." Jesse was interrupted before finishing his sentence. "I understand. I do. Yeah, we can talk about it tomorrow." News travels fast in a small town. All it takes is for one person to tell someone else something, and word spreads like water from a busted dam. Apparently, Sarah wasn't as discreet as she should have been about them visiting the old Atkins church, and word got back to Jesse's father. Needless to say, he didn't approve of Jesse going out there, and Jesse understood why. Jesse finished up his work and went to bed. That night, he had a dream about the old church. He dreamed he was standing in the pulpit, looking at all those shadowy faces in the church. It was quiet. Then suddenly, two hands firmly grabbed his shoulders. He turned to see who had grabbed him. It was Reverend Atkins. He looked like a man who had died of a sickness, almost like a skeleton. "Ah, welcome home, son," he said with a big smile on his face. "I knew you'd come back." Jesse woke up breathing heavily. He sat up in bed and rubbed the hair off his forehead. He saw his hand was wet with sweat. Oh, good Lord. I should have never gone to that damn place. The next day, after service, Jesse and Pastor Pierce talked about him going out to the old church. His father did not understand why he would want to visit the old place, which could have been very dangerous for both he and Sarah due to its old structure. And what was once the site of such wickedness, he assured his father that it was a stupid decision and that he would not be going back out there and not to worry. "Your birth father was an evil man, Jesse. Believe me, son, you don't want anything to do with his legacy. You've got a bright future here." "I know, Dad, I know. It won't happen again," Jesse told him. A couple of days later, Jesse found himself working late again in his study. He had just about put the whole thing behind him. He was now thinking about how he planned to propose to Sarah. He was juggling ideas when he was distracted by the sound of scratching again. He turned and looked at the old box, which he had almost forgotten about. The scratching noise was coming from inside it once again. Jesse got up and walked over towards it, but stopped. He thought for a second. What if there's some kind of animal or something in there that may have crawled in there, like a rat or a squirrel or something? Well, whatever you are, you've been in there all this time. You can survive one more night. I'll set you free in the morning. Jesse walked back to his desk. Then, three sharp knocks came from inside the box, startling Jesse. He turned to face the wooden box. He just stared in disbelief, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. All was silent for a couple of minutes. Then, three more sharp knocks came from the box. Jesse just stood there. He didn't know what to think or what to do. Then, continuous knocks began to come from the box. Over and over, Jesse grabbed his head in fear and frustration and yelled, "What do you want?" Immediately, the top on the box forcefully flew open, and a voice from within the box whispered, "You." A black snake crawled out of the box and made its way in front of Jessie. The snake reared up and made eye contact with him. Jessie looked the snake in its pitch black eyes and seemed to go into a trance-like state, just like Reverend Atkins had done. "Yes," Jessie said, answering the unheard question. "I want it all." The snake's eyes seemed to grow with intensity. "I will," Jessie said. He then grabbed the snake and began to grossly devour it, just as his real father, Reverend Atkins, had done all those years ago. Chunk by chunk, he bit off into his mouth until his mouth overflowed with the animal's flesh. His eyes had become completely black, just as the snake's were. Jessie stared up, completely taken by the spirit. His face was not that of his own. He looked like a man who had died of a sickness. He looked like Reverend Atkins. The next day, while at her parents' house, whom she lived with, Sarah's doorbell rang. It was Jessie. His appearance had gone back to normal, but he looked exhausted. The bags under his eyes were those of a person in need of some good sleep, and he smelled as though he could use a hot shower. "Hi, Jessie. Well, this is a nice surprise. What are you doing here?" "Sarah, I've got wonderful news to tell you. Can I come in?" Jessie asked. "Sure, come on in." "You look terrible. Are you feeling okay?" "Yes, better than ever. I was up late last night thinking," he said, the excitement beaming from his face. "I'm going into the ministry." He stood there for a second waiting for her reply. "What are you talking about?" she asked, wide-eyed. "I'm going to start preaching." "That's great, Jessie. Are you going to start co-pastoring with your dad at the church?" Jessie's face lost its smile, and immediately he became very serious. "No," he said, now looking almost angry. "I'm going to start my own church." "Why would you think I would preach alongside that man?" "That man?" Sarah said, sounding confused. "Why would you say that? That man is your father, and he's always been good to you. What's going on with you, Jessie?" "That man is not my father. He's done his job, but now it's time for me to tell the people the truth." Sarah just stared at him in disbelief and confusion. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you, Jessie, but I really think you need to get some rest." Jessie eased up. "Hey, I'm sorry. I know this is all new, but maybe everybody's right. Maybe it's time for me to step from behind the scenes. Maybe it's time for me to step up into the forefront. I'm ready. I want to preach to the world." Jessie had a wild enthusiasm about him. Sarah had never seen him like this before. It was very out of character for the normally reserved man. "Well, if you don't want to preach alongside your father, Pastor Pierce," Jessie corrected her. "If you don't want to preach alongside Pastor Pierce," she continued, "then where will you preach?" The smile returned to Jessie's face. "The old church." "What? Jessie, have you gone crazy? Please tell me this is a joke. That place is a death trap. I have it all figured out. I have enough in savings to do the renovations, and the location is perfect. People need to hear the truth, Sarah. They need true salvation." Sarah saw that he was actually serious. "I just can't believe you're really serious about this. What about what happened there in the past? And that psychopath, Avery Atkins?" Jessie's face lost its smile again. This time, the look made Sarah uncomfortable. It was a look that said, "Watch what you say." She actually felt something she'd never felt with Jessie before. She didn't feel safe. "We'll talk later," Jessie grimly said as he made his way past her and walked to the door. "Jessie, wait, I'm sorry," Sarah said as she started to tear up, but Jessie just kept going and left without saying a word. Later that day, Jessie went to his parents' house to tell them about his newfound interest in becoming a preacher. "Jessie, this is insane. How could you do this, son? Please don't do this," Pastor Pierce said. "Look, everything I have is yours. If you want to go into the ministry, do it by my side, but stay away from that church. What's gotten into you, son? Stop calling me your son. You've hidden the truth, and I mean to bring it to the light. I've been healed by the snake. What are you talking about, Jesse? What snake? His mother said. And why are you acting like this? How dare you speak to your father like that? Who have you been talking to, Jesse? Who's been filling your head with this foolishness? His father asked. I speak to he that is within me. When my church is finished, everyone, you'll all see. Jesse left his parents' house that day, leaving them in confusion and pain they'd never thought they would experience. From the well-mannered young man whom they'd lovingly raised as their own son for 23 years, Jesse returned to the church later that day. It was all he could think about. He felt it calling him, and he was compelled to go. When he arrived, he parked his car and began making his way to the entrance, only to notice that the front door was now all the way open this time. No one had been to the church. This was the church's way of welcoming him back home. He stepped through the front door, and it was as if he'd stepped back in time. The church was like new again. The walls in the small entry room were freshly painted. The wood floor was swept clean and polished. Even the old broken-down chair and bookshelf were clean and fixed. Jesse couldn't believe his eyes. He wondered if he was dreaming. But this was no dream. The church was alive again. There was something else that Jesse noticed. It was the sound of singing coming from the main area of the church. He walked up to the viewing door with the little window, which was now clean, and peeked through to see what was going on. What Jesse saw was even more shocking. The church was filled with people singing, clapping, and waving their hands. He pushed the door open, and the sound of the church came alive. It was bright and vibrant. The people sang passionately, and the energy was high. They were all dressed in old-styled clothing. Some even held snakes as they praised and sang. Jesse stood there for a few moments until he noticed a man in a black suit standing in front of the pulpit. His back was turned to Jesse, his arms spread high above his head, his long bony fingers spread apart as if he were receiving something. The choir's singing seemed to become distorted, the words unrecognizable. The congregation all of a sudden turned to face Jesse, their eyes wild and wide, fixed on him with intense focus. They continued to sing and give praise. Then the man at the front of the church in the black suit turned around. It was Reverend Atkins. Jesse stared at him in amazement and disbelief. The Reverend motioned for Jesse to come to him. Jesse slowly walked to him. A large snake crawled over his feet. A little girl came and picked up the serpent and held it as if it were a doll. All of the people followed his every step and watched as he made his way past them to Reverend Atkins. The Reverend reached out for Jesse and grabbed him by his shoulders. Welcome home, son. His eyes were black and empty as deep, dark wells. I've been waiting for you. We've all been waiting for you. Are you ready to take your place at my side? Jesse just stared at him in disbelief. This is all yours. We could lead them together. This is where you belong, Jesse. There is great power here, son. Great power indeed. Come with me, son. Stand beside your true father. But how is this possible? Jesse asked. Here, everything is possible. We are not tied down to the laws of man. All it takes is a little sacrifice. The Reverend smiled with a grin that stretched and distorted his bony face. He looked like a skeleton smiling, with big black eyes. "Are you ready to make that sacrifice, Jessie? We all had to. I had to. Your mother was my payment for salvation, a small price to pay for the wonders and the powers that I now possess. And you must do the same. Eternity, Jessie. Think about it. You can hold the keys to life and death." "Well, what do I have to do?" Jessie asked. "Bring me that young lady of yours, Sarah. Her soul is sweet and ripe. Oh, the things we could do with her soul." The Reverend's eyes almost rolled completely back into his head and fluttered. He licked his thin, dried lips as he said this. "What about my parents?" Jessie asked. Reverend Atkins' face became stern. "We have no need of them. Their beliefs are a repulsive smell to our noses. They are an enemy of our ways, of your way. Just bring me Sarah. You will do this, won't you, son?" Jessie's eyes were now as black as Reverend Atkins. "Yes, I will," Jessie said. "Praise be! Praise be!" Reverend Atkins yelled out. The church erupted in praise. "Go now. Bring her to us and claim your place." Jessie turned around. His eyes had now gone back to normal and faced the congregation. All their eyes were serpent black, their faces those of the long dead. They stared at him in silence as he left the church. Jessie reached the entry room and looked back, only to see the church was empty again, back to its old dilapidated state, rusty and dark. Unbothered by this, he turned and left. His mind was now one with New Dawn Spiritual Church. He was once again the son of Reverend Avery Atkins. Worried about Jessie, Sarah called his parents to find out if they knew what was going on with him. "He was acting so strangely, Pastor Pierce, going on about how he wanted to start his own church and how he needed to spread the truth. He just didn't seem like himself. He looked disheveled and he smelled bad. He even became angry when I questioned him about it. And honestly, I feel bad just saying this, but he made me feel very uneasy." Sarah sounded distressed. "We don't know either, Sarah. He came by here earlier, told us the same thing. It didn't go well," Pastor Pierce said. "I've never seen him like this before. He was so angry. And he said some really hurtful things. Maybe he's just overwhelmed with everything. Maybe he just needs a little break or something. I'm sure he'll be fine. But in the meantime, maybe you should just give him a little space. Let him clear his head. And for God's sake, stay away from that church." "Okay, Pastor Pierce. If you think that's best, I will." Sarah hung up the phone and sat there alone wondering what was going on with the man she thought she knew and loved. It just didn't make sense. Jessie was always so solid and level-headed. How could he have changed so much in seemingly overnight? Later that night, while Sarah was preparing for bed, she got a phone call. It was Jessie. "Hi, Sarah. It's me. Hey, look, I'm really sorry about what happened earlier. I don't know what got into me. How could I expect you to be on board with something so crazy?" He sounded calm and more like himself. "Jessie, why did you say those things? Were you telling the truth?" "Well, there's a lot going on," he said. "Hey, let me come by and pick you up. I'd like to talk to you. And I miss you." He may have sounded like himself, but it definitely was not him. On the other end of that phone was something else. He lay in the dark on the floor in his study room, slowly clawing at his face, tearing away at his flesh, his skin and blood under his fingernails. His eyes were wide and all white. He stretched his mouth into a fiendish grin. His dry lips peeled and bled into his mouth, staining his teeth. He spoke in a normal voice, through some dark, unnatural power, the power of the thing inside him. Sarah, completely unaware of the nightmare on the other end of the phone, agreed to let him pick her up so they could talk. She wanted to give him another chance to explain his odd behavior in person. She sat by the window, watching and waiting for his car to pull up. Sarah was feeling optimistic after their conversation on the phone. He sounded more like the man she was in love with, and assumed it was just one of those weird moments that all couples go through. She was ready to just put the whole thing behind them and get on with the great relationship she felt they had. Sarah snapped out of her thoughts when she saw car lights coming down the street. It was Jesse. He drove up and stopped in front of her house. Excited, Sarah ran out of the house and made her way to his car. She opened the car door and got in, immediately hugging Jesse, but he did not hug her back. Taken aback by his lack of affection, she pulled back only to see him staring at her with an empty smile on his face and thick bandages on his cheek. He might as well have been a mannequin. There was nothing behind his eyes or his smile. "What happened to your face?" she asked. "I had an accident with a rusty razor. No big deal." "I'm glad you agreed to meet me. I have something to show you." He turned his gaze from her and drove off, not saying a word. He just drove. "Jesse, where are we going? If you're not going to say anything, why did you bother picking me up?" "It will all make sense, Sarah. Just be patient," he said in a somber voice, not taking his eyes off the road. "Are you taking me to that church?" She started to become nervous. "Answer me!" Jesse remained silent. He looked over at her with an expressionless look on his face. "Everything will be all right. There's something you need to see if you want to understand. Just trust me." They pulled down the old dirt road that led to the church. It was pitch black besides the car lights. "Jesse, this doesn't make sense. I don't like this. Please, just take me home." Jesse stopped the car in front of the church, got out and walked around to Sarah's side of the car and opened the door. "I'm not going in there. Take me home now, Jesse." He just stared at her blankly. "Take me home!" She was both angry and scared now. He grabbed her by her arm and pulled her out of the car. "You need to see this. If you want to understand everything, you need to see." He was becoming aggressive now. He dragged her toward the church. She tried to pull away from him, but he was too strong for her to break free and get away. She yelled for someone to help her, but there was no one around here to hear her screams. She cried and pleaded to him, "Jesse, please, no, don't do this." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. He just dragged her through the dark moonlit woods to the church. In the dark, everything looked menacing. The shadows, the trees, took on life forms of living things, and Jesse was feeding her to them. Once they reached the church, she saw the door was wide open. It was dark, and she could feel the cold coming from inside the church. "This will all be over soon, Sarah. You're a part of a bigger plan now, bigger than yourself," he said, pulling her inside the church. She could hear singing coming from the main area of the church, though it was too dark to see anything. "Jesse, please, don't do this. Let me go. Don't take me in there. Why are you doing this?" Jesse stopped, and in a voice that did not sound like his own, coldly said, "There is no stopping this." He opened the door to the main area and pulled her in. It was dark, but the moonlight shone through the windows. There were people sitting in the pews, but the darkness covered their faces. They sat stiff and still. Sarah screamed and struggled, but she could not get away. The people in the pews all turned their heads at the same time and looked at once. "I have returned, just as I said I would. I brought her to you. I kept my word," Jesse yelled out. "Ah, indeed you have, my son. Indeed you have. The soft voice cut through the silence. Sarah looked to see where the voice came from. It came from the pulpit. Standing there was Reverend Avery Atkins. Sarah screamed in fright at the sight of the dead man. "Bring her to me, my son, and let us begin," he said, staring wildly with his black eyes and wide smile on his face. The shadow people all followed with their heads as Jessie dragged Sarah past them, taking her to Reverend Atkins. She cried and begged, but there was no sympathy for her here, no humanity, because they were not human. Reverend Atkins stretched his arms out and extended his long bony fingers to receive her. Sarah pulled her arm back in one more attempt to break free. It worked. She ran for the door past the pews of shadow people, but screamed in pain as she felt something bite down into her calf. She looked down to see Jessie biting into her leg. He looked up at her with those black shark-like eyes and bit in deeper, causing her to fall to the floor. She turned over and began to try to scoot backwards away from him, but he pursued her. She stared up at him, her eyes blurred by sweat and tears. Jessie walked slowly towards her, his arms raised as if he were picking up a child. Sarah kept backing away, but he just kept coming. He had a blank expression on his face, and his mouth was covered with her blood. The man that had once been Jessie Pierce was no more. He grabbed her by her hair and began dragging her back to Reverend Atkins. "Jessie, no! He's not your father! Pastor Pierce raised you. They love you. Don't do this. Fight this thing, Jessie. Fight. This is not who you are." He grabbed her by the face, and she looked in his eyes. "I love you. This is not who you are. These things are evil. You are not one of them. You're alive. You're a child of God. Fight this thing, Jessie." Jessie seemed to be responding to her. She was getting through to him. "Jessie, bring her to me," Reverend Atkins yelled. "You need to give your sacrifice. You need to offer her. She must be offered with your hands. Give her to me now." Jessie turned to look at him, but Sarah grabbed his face before he could make eye contact with the dead man. "Jessie, I love you. This isn't real. They're all dead." Jessie was fighting for control now. "Bring her to me, damn you!" Reverend Atkins screamed, his voice now distorted and angry. "No," Jessie said. "What did you say, boy?" Reverend Atkins said in a gritty whisper. "I said no." Just then, Jessie gagged, grabbed his stomach and bent over in pain. "Jessie, what's wrong?" Sarah said while holding him up, trying to keep him from collapsing. He continued gagging. His body began to jerk violently until he started throwing up. He threw up chunks and chunks of the snake and black liquid. Sarah even saw the whole head of the snake come out of his mouth. "No!" Reverend Atkins screamed. "You damn fool! You won't leave here alive! You're done, boy!" Jessie made his way to his feet and caught his breath, completely back now. "Sarah, run!" They ran for the door, but the people grabbed at them and attempted to stop them. Jessie tried to fight them off, but there were just too many of them. He pushed Sarah towards the door as they grabbed and clawed at him. He was able to push her out of the main area and into the small waiting room. "Sarah, run! Get out of here!" As soon as he was able to get her out of there, the hands of the dead congregation grabbed him and pulled him back into the darkness. She could hear him yelling for her to get out. Then, just him screaming in the dark. It sounded as if he were being torn apart. It was awful. "Jessie!" she screamed, but there was nothing she could do. Nothing but escape. She ran through the woods. The sound of the people in the church yelling behind her sent chills through her body. She ran with all the strength she had left and was waiting for hands to pull her back into the church. The fear was overwhelming. She didn't look back. She just kept running until she reached the car. To her luck, Jessie had left the keys in the car. She started it and drove out of there as fast as she could. Sarah told her story about what happened that night. Some believed her, and some didn't. She soon moved away from Hornsby and never came back. The story became one of the town's most infamous tales, and Jessie was never seen after that night. Some said you could sometimes hear what sounded like a choir singing, coming from the area in the woods where the old church was. Pastor Pierce would soon go on to buy the old church and immediately had it torn down. Hello all, and thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you've liked this content, please click the like button, share, and subscribe to receive notifications for new dark stories. Until the next time, be good to each other. It's a scary world out there.